let's get started. So in the 1640s, a religious scholar called Roshikonando was traveling through Eastern India, preaching and converting local rulers to his sectarian theology. We are told in his Bengali hagiography, the Roshikomongol, that he had both musicians and music scholars in his retinue, and that he routinely traveled with a collection of books on music. And this traveling library was a tool in his mission, since he apparently converted one king by playing the 6 iconic ragas on his flute, and he used to draw in crowds with his music and his learning. So this is from the hagiography. It says, Roshik, the lord of connoisseurs, heard the words from the Brahmin's lips and began his journey that very moment. He brought so much musical literature, shongito shohito, and took his followers with him. So here the hagiography refers to the literature, shohito, of music, shongito, although this term actually encompasses a broader sense of the performing arts, namely vocal and instrumental music, the art of narrative gesture, which he used particularly in dance, and dance itself. Because his emphasis was on the scholarly disposition of the saint, the hagiographer also talks about another word, a shastra or shastra in Sanskrit, a canonical knowledge system. And this term shastra can refer to religious texts. Those of you who work on Buddhism will know this word, but also to what's in Sanskrit is called Sangita Shastra, which is usually translated today as musicology. What did this traveling library look or sound like? The hagiographer doesn't give us many details, but he does describe Roshikonando's general reading practices in the following terms. He says how resplendent with a volume in his lotus hands, how he recalled the name of God upon his lips. And here the word gront or grunty in the original can conventionally be translated as book, though Tyler Williams, who's at Chicago, and he's one of the only people working on the history of the book in Hindi manuscripts, he's recently suggested that it refers less to a physical object and more to the abstract concept of a collected work. The word grant or gront comes from the term knot, as in tying or binding ideas together. And notably, the text in the hands is activated through verbalization on the lips. And the hagiography places special emphasis on how people respond to hearing his learning. So this was all happening in Eastern India in the 1640s. If we leap forward 200 years and then relocate to Rajasthan in Western India, we find the British agent, James Todd, giving an account of a Rajput aristocrat, Shivdan Singh. He was well read in the classical literature of his nation, deeply versed in the secrets of the chronicles, not only of Mewar, the kingdom, but also of all Rajvara, so the larger region. He was conversant with all the mysteries of the bard and could improvise on every occasion. He was a proficient in musical science and could discourse most fluently on the whole theory of Sangita, so there's that word again, which comprehends vocal and instrumental harmony. He could explain each of the ragas or musical modes which issue from the 5 mouths of Shiva, the god, and his consort Mira, together with the almost endless variations of the ragas, to each of which are allotted 6 consorts or raginis. I'll explain this in a minute. He had attached to his suite the first vocalists of the kingdom of Mewar and occasionally favored me by letting them sing at my house. So here, James Todd notes the Maharaja's scholarly approach to music, especially his understanding of the variations of ragas, which was indeed a key concern of early modern music scholars. He also gestures to the relationship between orality and text, especially by mentioning the bardic literature, which was transmitted in both formats, orally and written. Indeed, part of the obvious challenge of musical literature is the disconnect between the written remnant we can still access through the manuscripts and its auditory or performative dimensions, which are much harder to reconstruct. So it might seem clumsy to move over a 200-year period and almost 1,600 kilometers. However, at this stage, we only have a very slight understanding of the shape of musical learning in northern India at this time. So it's perhaps necessary to cast a wide net. In my earlier work, I've suggested that by looking across this whole range, we find a connected trans-regional and multilingual conversation about musical theory and aesthetics, which, as we can see here, became embedded in both courtly and religious scholarship. However, were these diverse and disparate scholars reading the same works and in the same material formats. So in this paper, I want to share a few thoughts about the sources and the varieties of musical manuscripts being produced over a long period from around 1500 to 1900 of the Common Era. I'll primarily be focusing on works written in classical Hindi, so Brajbhasha, which became the preeminent vernacular literary language over this period. And it was used by scholars between Rajasthan in the west and Bengal in the east, but also circulated northwards into Nepal. I'll begin by introducing the core topics which are covered in works on music, then briefly survey the formats of the manuscripts. And my main interest today is in the editorial possibilities of Hindi's scribal culture. So I'll give some examples of the opportunities, but also the challenges scribes face while working with this very technical subject. So let's begin with the music in the music manuscript. So there were three larger categories of musical literature in the early modern period, which often overlapped in a single work. So the first is what I've already mentioned, the science of music or musicology, Sangita Shastra. And this system of knowledge was largely inherited from works in Sanskrit. In particular, many followed a division of topics that had been set up in the 13th century in a work called the Sangita Ratnakara, the Sea of Music. Different Sanskrit treatises had different reception histories according to region. In the north, the Sangita Darpana, the mirror of music, was especially influential, particularly when a Hindi intellectual, Hari Vallabha, translated or rather adapted it around 1650. And his treatise is often called the vernacular version of the mirror of music, so Sangita Darpana Bhasha, or sometimes the essence of music, i.e. the summary of music. Other treatises were less directly indebted to a single Sanskrit work. In general, they could draw from a selection of set topics. This could include the nature of the note, variations of the scale, raga, rhythm, dance, good and bad qualities in singing, and so on. And these treatises need to be seen as part of a larger arena of translation and reflection on Sanskrit music studies, as new works emerge not only in Hindi, which I'm focusing on here, but also in Bengali and Persian, and so on. Of the different topics within a music treatise, Hindi scholars were especially drawn to the chapter on the aesthetics of the raga, which is often crudely translated as mode in English. A raga could be discussed formally, so for example, which notes to include or exclude in the ascent or the descent of the scale, but it could also be discussed poetically through a visualization of the rag. So in essence, every rag had a distinctive name, a time of day, a gender, a seasonal association, emotional connotation, but also a visual vignette, which would be called a chana, a visualization. And this practice of visualizing a piece of music was inherited from meditation exercises where you would visualize a deity in your mind. These visualizations could be described poetically. So for example, a virile red king upon an elephant on a hot day surrounded by adoring women. But you could take that one line and then turn it into an extended poem if you wanted to. So some treatise writers, including the translator I mentioned, Hari Vallabha, he grew the poetry in the chapter on rag extensively, whereas others reduced all the other material and topics and actually just focused on these images of the rags. And so this created a form of literature called ragamala, which means a garland of rags, i.e. you string together all of these visions of music and create a garland out of it. And so much so, in fact, that this category can be considered its own separate category of writing on music. In particular, scribes and painters worked together and extracted these verses and turned them into paintings with a text attached to it. And in fact, this is the most common form of ragamala, as we'll see. The third category is the songbook, which appears in extremely varied formats. Some were planned holistically and strategically. So here we have the Sahasras, which was the Emperor Shah Jahan's songbook, and it was the culmination of a research project which was interested in defining and curating a very specific set of lyricists. More typically, you get songs added incrementally to a blank notebook. Spaces are left for technical details, in particular, the name of a rag that you might want to prescribe to a lyric. So often you get those blank spaces where those could be added later. Sometimes you have long sections of blank pages where someone thinks that they'll add songs later. This is in particular in songbooks where it's arranged around season or a particular festival. So you say, oh, we'll add some more songs for the rainy season at another time. These Books are generally not notated, but you can get some inference of musical prescription. So this could include the addition of names of rags and tals, i.e. rhythms, sometimes meaningful punctuation, or the addition of musical terms to mark a refrain in particular. Or in the 19th century, you also have things like this where formal sections of the song are marked as well to define the different parts of the lyric structure. Some of these additions may have been influenced by printing practices, which slowly gained ground in South Asia from 1800 onwards. Printed songbooks become one of the major components of the book publishing industry from the 1860s and fed back into manuscript culture. So I've seen handwritten copies of published music treatises and song anthologies, including quite big, hefty projects that someone copied out laboriously. Again, these were not always discrete categories. So, for example, there's one text, the Surataranga, a wave of music from 1748, that begins with elements of a music treatise, but then foregrounds the Ragamala with all the visions, and then continues into a song anthology. So in the single work, you actually have aspects of all three forms. And confusingly, while Ragamala usually refers to what I've described as the set of visions, it can also just mean a garland of songs. So actually you also get song anthologies called a ragamala, which can be frustrating sometimes when you're going through a catalogue. It's also worth noting that there are other kinds of material that I'm just not including here. In particular, recently I found court histories that were set to music as well, but I haven't figured out how that would have worked yet. So let's just quickly talk about the formats of manuscripts. So here I refer to the work of Tyler Williams. We're not related. He helpfully identified three key formats for the Hindi book in this period. So the first one is called the Poti, which is an organized and purposefully designed book. It's often intended for circulation and multiple owners. It's a paper book that imitated the dimensions of a palm leaf manuscript. So you have loose folios that you turn over accordingly, usually in this horizontal format. You bind the loose folios together and store them between two boards tied with string, or wrap them in a kind of red cloth bag. And so, yes, even now when you go to archives in India, often they'll bring out a big red sack effectively, and inside will be these loose folios sandwiched between two balls and tied with string. And so this format's very, very common. The second form, which is slightly more familiar perhaps to those who work in Europe, is the kitab. It's a bound codex, usually in leather or wood or cardboard. It could be extensively illuminated, and related to this are other kinds of more informal writings and notebooks as well. Less common in Brajbhasha music scholarship, to be honest, but there are some interesting examples. And then this is very common. The gutka, which means a lump or a ball, is a notebook in which paper folios are just folded over each other and then bound or sewn together with string. And so if you imagine, if you keep doing this, eventually it creates a sort of lumpy side. And so this is where the term lump or ball comes from, because it creates a rounded shape to the book. The gutka is a very pragmatic format. It could easily be added to. You could just insert extra folios over time. It could consist of one or dozens or even hundreds of works. Some gutkas are incredibly large, and they could be small, serving as a sort of personal handbook, or a large miscellany for long-term storage and filing effectively. Tyler Williams once referred to a gutka as a textual suitcase, which I agree with. Musical works can be found across all of these formats. Brajbhasha treatises in particular prefer the Poti format. Ragamala and songbooks are usually formatted like a gutka, but they also appear in the large suitcase style gutkas as well. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was looking at some of these multi-work gutkas in the Royal Palace at Jodhpur. And in one very large manuscript where you have lots of different religious poems and stories all written out together, almost like a memory stick of different files, we find all kinds of musical material. We find a song collection, as well as a paragraph that just lists the names of rags with no details about them, but just lots and lots of names. These portions of the text have been assembled from disparate sources, obviously. There's one hand running throughout this large suitcase gutka, and the scribe makes a note when he's missing a letter in his source text. In the case of songs, some lyrics are assigned with rag and tal settings, but in other cases, he's left a blank space, which you can see here. It's unclear why some songs songs have musical details and others don't, but it may yet offer further clues about his source material. And just in case people are interested, I'm not talking about it today, but because I'm interested in Nepal, we also have the concertina songbooks. These were primarily designed for Buddhist and Tantric religious music. So the next section, I'm going to break down kind of aspects of where I see scribes really being strategic and ingenious with this very technical, difficult material. And then I'm going to move on to where they make mistakes and struggle with the topic, which is fair enough. So ingenuity first. Musical texts are very versatile. They can be adapted for different kinds of aesthetic engagement. Indeed, most people will have come across a ragamala in particular, not as a poti or a bound manuscript, but rather as loose folios, where you have a painting of the visualization that illustrates a poetic text, usually contained in an enclosed upper register. And this format was also extensively used for two other genres of poetry. So it's not just a music thing, it's adapting and responding to different genres. Part of the challenge of working with this material is these folios are often dispersed. And so you'll find one or two coming out for auction in Sotheby's, and then you have to keep looking and try to piece it together with other loose folios. Elsewhere, I've suggested that scribes made ingenious interventions in the layout and arrangement of musicological material, which augmented the content, the scholarly value, and the performative potential of a text. So, for example, this 19th century manuscript, the Ragamala Kosha, which is kind of like a directory of ragamalas, was designed as a pocket-sized digest of technical material. So each rag is summarily described effectively with brief bullet points of what you should be imagining, and then you get a neat table to describe the arrangement and motion of notes in performance. So rather than having to work your way through a giant book, you can just very quickly flick through, and like I say, it does fit into your pocket. So it's a very clever digest. It's possible to trace the different options scribes developed by looking at different versions of a single text. So here I'm just going to focus on Harivallabha's adaptation translation of the Sangita Darpana. So the earliest copies, which start in 1653, were written in that standard poti and scripta continua format. But then by the 18th century, you start seeing interesting things. We find scribal interventions. So in one poti manuscript, where you get to the Ragamala verses, the scribe takes the final half line, which has that ending rhyme, and he copies and pastes it to the start of the verse so that the poem begins and ends with the same phrase. And this duplication allows it to be arranged as a song text, where a short phrase would act as a sung refrain between lines in a performance. So in other words, he's taken these poems and prepared them to be sung. So this technical, heavy music treatise is now singable, at least in this chapter. We also find blank spaces here, which gives the impression that the verses have been separated. The blank spaces are introduced by a sentence, which translates as a scale sequence by Jivan Khan, which is a name of a musician. So this anticipates some kind of musical prescription that's been prepared by a named musician, which it wasn't there in the early recensions. Indeed, we find that in another manuscript from the 18th century, which does indeed use sargam letters of the scale with punctuation and superscript numbering to present skeletal notated sequences for each rag. So this manuscript, in fact, actually has a number of interventions. The scribe has focused only on the chapters relating to raga and rhythm. He's cut everything else. He's provided 3 versions of the text: the Sanskrit, Harivallabha's translation, and then a very basic, simple Hindi prose explanation as well. And then he's also added these notations by the musician Jivan Khan. And it's quite mysterious. And to be honest, it's pretty unusual compared to other manuscripts in this period. It's unclear who commissioned this manuscript or what this sort of basic prosaic Hindi was intended for. However, it is part of a larger collection of works compiled by an East India Company officer called Richard Johnson, who was active in the 18th century. And it's possible then that this extended format was designed for a curious non-Indian reader. Johnson's collection also includes some very unusual ragamala paintings, including one album where Harivallabha's verses have been taken out of the text and split up line by line into the bodies of birds perching on a tree. So between these different scribes and painters, we get a sense of how a musical text could be adapted into new formats. You could add translations, glosses, song structures, notations, and original painted layouts. At the same time, we also see one scribe struggling with the addition of a notation. I.e. where we have the blank spaces and he says, here's the notation sequence, and then he panics and doesn't put it in. My sense is that he was a meticulous scribe, professional scribe. I suspect that he did not want to copy out a notation he didn't understand, but never returned to fill in those blank spaces. And this gestures to the pitfalls of copying out technical musical material, which indeed we can see in other works. So now on to scribal struggles. Musical texts aren't easy. They contain specialist terms that the scribe may not have come across before, or words that look like a common word, but actually aren't, and so on. Syllabic notations and non-lexical phrases can be incorporated into these texts and can pose all kinds of problems. And sometimes we find scribes asking for forgiveness from their readers in the event that they've made a mistake in their copying. This is another version of Hari Vallabha's text where at the bottom the scribe says he wrote the Shastra with a tight fist, his head weighed down with the difficulty. Occasionally, the scribes have struggled to make any sense of the musical scholarship. A 19th century manuscript in the Bodleian, Wilson 301, is a compilation of musical texts in Sanskrit and Hindi, and it is rife with scribal errors. Even the word for music is occasionally misspelled. And these kinds of error make some manuscripts effectively unusable in certain sections. If we compare two editions of this text, the text itself is from the 17th century, probably 1630s. These are two 19th century copies, probably 19th century, one in Nepal, one in Rajasthan. Basically, when you compare them, there are a few mysterious things. First of all, in the Nepal copy of the text, it's describing a rag that should have 5 notes. It says it should have 5 notes, but it only gives 4 because it's lost one of them. He gives a particular scalar understanding of the rag, which isn't there in other copies of this text. So it's a bit confusing about where that's come from. In that different way of configuring the rag, he gives completely different notes. He misspells some of those notes. He also spells accent and dissent the same way. So again, if you didn't know what you were looking at, it would just make no sense at all. So it's odd because on the one hand, it's quite technical with this inclusion of scalar material, but on the other hand, it's meaningless. So this suggests a pretty complex transmission history where some scribes were involved with the copying of this text and adding new material, but on the other hand, other scribes just not understanding what was happening at all. A final area for thinking about scribes is in relation to the painted ragamalas. A single folio can actually raise a whole range of questions in its own right. I'm talking about this folio, which is now in the Danish Royal Library, probably from the 18th century. So again, we have a visualization, a chana, and then we have the verse describing it. Note the yellow box at the top of the painting. That's where the verse should have gone, but maybe the scribe just thought there wasn't enough space or something, and so he's written it on the back. Let's just have a quick look at that text. So some of it's technical, but the poetry is quite nice. So on Malkus Rag and his attendant Raginis, and then we have a couplet which lists them. Tori, Tori, Kolkap, Kamaj, and Kedar. These 5 Raginis, so forms of rag, are resplendent besides Malkos, their lord. And then it gives you the visualization of Malkos. It's calling it a chalpai, which is a kind of quatrain. It's not a chalpai. And also the doha, it's not a doha. That's a form of couplet, and it's wrong. So Malkos is very intelligent and proud. His body is golden. His voice is exquisite. He sits upon a gold throne in a palace. He drinks and takes supreme pleasure. A maidservant dispels with the fly whisk in her hand. A heavenly minstrel speaks, his fair body resplendent. A maiden is shining with the intense light of lust. And then we need another line to finish it, but it's missing. Then it says complete, even though it's incomplete. And then we have a couplet, which again is wrong. Absorbed in her love, her companion goes to the forest to await Hari's arrival. With every passing moment, the world passes away, and she makes a garland with the desires of her mind. So the artist, the painter, has visualized this vignette very nicely, and he's closely followed the description in the poem. So we have the Lord on his golden throne. He's been given a musical instrument, perhaps to suggest his beautiful voice. The celestial musician plays before him, but it's been depicted in a pretty drab grey, perhaps to offset the magnificent essence of the courtly rag. One woman does indeed wield a fly whisk, another is swooning with arousal, and the artist has also created a frisson of dramatic energy by depicting the lusting woman on the side, you can just see here, as different from the Lord's choice companion, who is beautiful but apparently calm and collected. So basically the artist, the painter, has done all kinds of interesting things here, and when you zoom in, it's really, really nicely done. However, there is also this mystery of the bright yellow box. Why has it been left blank? Why have the lines been written on the reverse? And there are other strange things happening in this text. The lines do not rhyme neatly. The indications of the meter are wrong. The verse is apparently incomplete. And either these were the scribe's own errors, or he's dutifully copied them from his source text. And the corrupted rhymes are not very satisfying, but they could be adapted by the reader, sounding it out to make sense. But the incorrect meters and the incomplete verse cannot be resolved. But besides these inaccuracies, the scribe has also augmented the conceptualization, the vision of the rag. And the final couplet, which again is not actually a doha, adds this extra level of interpretation. It evokes the feelings of a desperate lover consumed in the anticipation of meeting her love. And the couplet picks up on the theme of a woman's lust in the original verse, but now the conceptual universe has completely shifted to a different imaginary, where we've left the court and now we're in a forest, and it's tapping into a mythological narrative. So was this verse intended as a juxtaposition to shift the reader's mind to other instances of romantic longing? Or was this short verse actually a lyric for a song that could be sung in this rag? Or was it copied randomly and only has an unintended bearing on the vision? Again, without a larger set of folios from this production, it's actually very difficult to know. This is the only one that I found of this particular production. So just to wrap up, my conclusions are very preliminary, and so they'll be brief. I'm often asked about notation in these materials, and to echo Richard Widdis's observations for an earlier period, while there are some interesting and emergent forms of notation occurring here, they're not the principal focus of music scholars in this context. This reflects the nature of musical performance itself, which was the intellectual property of hereditary service providers who did not want or need to write down their compositions, and who valued improvisation, so would have found too rigid a prescription unappealing. So what were the priorities of music scholars, especially if they were going to acquire performance practice from alternative and indeed oral sources? Technical musical information varies across the manuscripts. The same text can be compiled with accuracy and detail, sometimes with glosses and helpful translations, or it can be mishandled and become confused over time. Part of the complexity of this project is the issue of working with a small set of extant sources. Given the longer and wider history of this transmission of these materials, how far can we talk about the agency of specific scribes? Who was innovating? Who was making a mistake, and who was copying someone else's interventions? We also need to consider the scribe as often working as part of a team, sometimes collaborating with painters, sometimes with musicians, like in that example of working with Jeevan Khan, but also in the anonymous cases where a musician may have been consulted to provide the names of a rag and help fill in the blanks in a manuscript songbook. We know that this kind of consultation was happening in the 19th century with printed songbooks, so we can safely assume that this was also a background conversation for manuscripts. This survey also raises intriguing questions about how people engaged with musical knowledge. Lists of raga names and their arrangement in families were considered useful knowledge. But why? This partly reflects a larger intellectual culture that valued list making, but also suggests that some practical applications were there too. Did painters and songbook writers consult these lists, or someone else? Evidently, part of connoisseurship, especially when the connoisseur might not be a practicing musician, it was to have the technical terms at their fingertips. But what about these technical terms when they were wrong? The incorrect material in some of these manuscripts raises yet further questions about the readers of these books. There was evidently a range from aesthetes hoping to deepen their appreciation, to collectors who valued having the information in the books preserved, but perhaps didn't actually plan to read them in any depth, to those users who needed tables, notations, and glosses as practical tools on their musical journey. I'll finish there. Thank you.